Hi everyone, I'm your host, Nicole Wood. Welcome to Scicomm Monday. Today we're going to be diving into some Great Lakes fun and talking about some science communication, and then we'll be highlighting the upcoming IAGLR 2017 conference, which yours truly and today's guests will also be at. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's guest. It's Allison Voglesong. She's a Michigan Sea Grant and IJC fellow, and she's currently in Windsor, Ontario. So welcome to the broadcast, Allison.
Thanks for having me, Nicole.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself so everyone knows where you're coming from and like how you got to where you are today.
Sure. I came to doing science communications in sort of a roundabout way. Basically, the first job I had after I completed my undergraduate at Michigan State University in international relations was at a green building certification company. And what I learned there was that communicating to the clients was the hardest thing to do and the most important for their business model. And I got really interested in multimedia communication, so I went to work for a small film company in Royal Oak, Michigan, which is outside of Detroit. And there I learned how to do certain kinds of film, especially public service announcements, which aren't necessarily like ads where you're selling something, but you're trying to tell people what they should do that's good for them, but in a way that's not preachy or mom-ish. And I think there's a lot of similarity between what the public health world has and science communication has, which is that you're trying to sort of nudge people to understand something without telling them just explicitly, this is how it is, and if you don't think that, then you're wrong. And you have to make it a little interesting. And so that was really beneficial for me. And with that knowledge of videos and multimedia communication, I started working in different water and Great Lakes specific areas. I used to intern at Circle of Blue, and if you haven't followed Circle of Blue, they're online global water news source, and they do a lot of great infographics and videos, and they cover a lot of really interesting topics about water, the water energy food nexus all around the world. So that was a great experience. And then I worked for a nonprofit called Flow in Traverse City, and they do some really excellent work regarding Great Lakes and protecting the Great Lakes waters through the public trust. And I was able to help them improve their multimedia communications there. And now what I do at the IJC is also produce multimedia for them, specifically for the Great Lakes Regional Office that's in Windsor, Ontario. And that office primarily exclusively works on the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And so the aspects of the Great Lakes that we work in is water quality in all 5 of the Great Lakes. And we just wrapped up a bunch of public meetings around the lakes, and that was really great to hear and really gain an appreciation for all the different ways that different people love the lakes and interact with the lakes, and all the different priorities that they have for the lakes. So anyway, that's what I've just been finishing up with, and that's sort of how I got from point A to point B here today.
Great. Yeah, I mean, that's a diverse background that a lot of us in Scicomm don't necessarily have. I think a lot of us, or at least in my circles of science communication, I should clarify that a little bit more. It's more the scientist dabbling in that communication aspect rather than someone who's more coming from that communication and getting into the science behind it. So for everyone out there, any questions you have, make sure that you send those in, and we'll try to get those answered as best we can. If we don't get to all of your questions during the actual broadcast, make sure that you tweet your questions, and we'll get to them later, especially if you're watching this on replay afterwards. So I guess one of my big questions is, since you're coming into it from that more of that communications background of things, is what's some of the biggest mistakes that you see scientists and other organizations or science-based organizations making when they start dabbling in social media and science communication?
Well, I don't know if it's a mistake as much as it is just a really universal challenge, which is that jargon is simpler language than you think it is. And so, because you're totally immersed in the field, you think that certain terms are the simplified version of it. But you really want to be writing to or communicating to, a 7th to 10th grade reading level. And so, certain things that's just what it is, right? There is a simpler way, but it seems oversimplifying. And sometimes there's, I think, a challenge where scientists feel that in clarifying language or in eliminating jargon, somehow the science or the merit of the science gets lost or is misconstrued. And it's definitely a fine line to tread. But I think that there's a lot of jargon that scientists don't appreciate as jargon because that is the language that's used, but maybe not necessarily to a lay audience. And I find myself also having to revise, and go back and just find synonyms that average people might understand better. And the power of metaphor, I think, is really good there, making analogies to everyday experiences that people have, even though it might not necessarily be exactly the same scientific process. Being able to relate to everyday people using simple language it's just really hard. So I see that as a mistake, but not one that is a folly. It's just a mistake that is very common because it's so challenging.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great point you made. During one of the broadcasts that I did while I was over in New Jersey with all the students from Rutgers and the NJIT, it was, someone said something about transect. And for us, it's a very common term that we use in science, but for somebody who might not have that background, they can maybe kind of guess what it is, but they need that clarification, and to be able to make those analogies of things in their daily life that they can pick up and understand. It helps them to follow along with that science so much easier, because as soon as you start losing them with a couple of words and they stop paying attention to what it is you're saying, and the next thing you know, your message is just completely lost. And
Yeah, exactly. And I think part of it too, what makes good science communication is when, sort of like what makes a good mystery novel, is when people feel smart because they figured it out and they put it together and they're following along with you. And so, just like the reader of a mystery novel has an aha moment, like I knew that it must have been, whatever. I think that science communication is similar in that you want to give your audience the tools so that way when you're finally saying, and the conclusion is this, they get it too, and they feel smart, or they feel fulfilled, or they feel that same excitement that you feel as a scientist because they can follow along in such a way that they can put everything together. And synthesizing the information that you're giving them is just as engaging as each of the constituent elements of the parts itself. So, yeah, it's not easy. That's
so,
for sure.
In a way, like trying to help them gain ownership of that message that you're giving them and feel like, okay, I'm a part of this and can understand this, and is a big thing.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Because then they feel like they know why. And then if you have ownership, like you were saying, you'll also want to explain to other people about it, versus if you were just told something, then that's more passive than active. So
yeah, it's that, I guess, the difference between feeling like you're getting lectured at versus someone's having a discussion with you about it. You feel like you're that active participant, so you're more enjoying the process rather than, okay, why do I have to be here listening to this again?
Exactly.
Right. So you're currently in Windsor, Ontario, when you're at the offices of the IJC. So tell us a little bit about the IJC for people who don't even, one, know what that stands for, and how that whole Joint Commission actually works.
Oh, yeah. How the whole Joint Commission actually
explain the whole
works.
thing, and you've got 2 minutes to do it.
Okay. All right. That's a Scicomm challenge, yeah. But it's accepted. So, International Joint Commission, the border agents always like to tease me if that has anything to do with marijuana. It does not. That just makes me blush when they ask me when I cross the border. So, the Joint Commission started in 1909 because the US and Canada signed a treaty between the two countries. And the treaty, called the Boundary Waters Treaty, negotiated a system to settle any sort of conflict that the two countries might have regarding water bodies that the boundary between the two nations. Back then, forests were diverted, especially out in the West, the breadbasket, and it was an issue for certain waterways that flow. The downstream users were getting less water, and the levels were down because upstream users were diverting so much for agriculture. And so, in order to avert and resolve conflicts that could arise from high or low water levels on these transboundary or international waterways, they created the International Joint Commission to do that conflict resolution. And the IJC's mandate expanded when the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement came about, as part of some work that the International Joint Commission actually did. So when the IJC works on an issue, they don't just have carte blanche, but the governments of the US and Canada have to give them a reference and ask them to work on something. And one of the issues around the time of the 70s that the IJC was given reference to was the water quality on the Great Lakes. Before that, really, the IJC was limited to water levels in transboundary waters. And so from that work, the US and Canada, instead of signing a treaty, they signed an agreement. And that created the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And that agreement created the Great Lakes Regional Office. And the agreement had been amended with protocols and then updated several times, most recently in 2012. And the agreement looks at all of the Great Lakes as an ecosystem. And it's separated, the current version of it is separated into annexes, as well as it has goals and objectives relating to human health. And so the Great Lakes Regional Office of the International Joint Commission, what they do is oversee the implementation and progress of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and do a lot of science and do a lot of public engagement, and are really the coordinating body for the agreement and for Great Lakes water quality. Whereas the rest of the IJC, they have an office in Washington, D.C. and an office in Ottawa, Ontario, and they do the administration for basically everything else, including the levels on the Great Lakes and levels on the other transboundary waters that they have references and boards for. So our office, we don't do things like the Niagara Board of Control. We just do the water quality. So it's a really interesting and multifaceted organization, international organization, and it's really the only one of its kind in the world. I mean, it's definitely a model for some of the river basin organizations in other regions where there's rivers that cross between the two countries, but it's the only treaty organization that really does the specific functions that the IJC does.
Yeah, that was one of the interesting things, is being involved in a university that we do a lot of Great Lakes research. Was I had always heard of the IJC and knew that they were involved with the Great Lakes, but it wasn't until the last year or so that I learned that it actually is that whole entire border and all of those rivers and other joint waters that go in between that the IJC is a part of. And that was like really interesting to learn. It's not just our little, corner of the world. It's all along that, border. And that was really interesting to see. So, with your part, like, you just work in the Great Lakes area for the IJC. Okay.
Yep.
And then, with that, like, I remember visiting you last year and your office there in Windsor. I was always so jealous of, because you have such an amazing view of the river there, that's flowing in between Windsor and Detroit, and you get this wonderful view to be able to like kind of remind you every day of what your job is and what you're doing and why it's so important. And I guess what's one of the most interesting things with having to be working in Canada besides, the border guards giving you a hassle when you say what it is that you're working for? I guess, what is it like to have to work for a binational organization? Like, what are some of the, maybe like, troublesome like issues that you have, like maybe like, some things, and then also what are some really good fun things that you might not get, with working just with an organization that's solely in one country or another?
hmm Well, I'll start with the fun things and the slightly silly things, which are that I never realized there's so many different ways you can say the word a, and it has a lot of meaning. The analogy I like to draw is similar to how there's so many different ways to say the word right. So I've definitely picked up a bit on that. And also, Canadians say process, it's not process. So you're talking to a Canadian if they're talking about process.
Yeah,
but
I
I
was gonna
think
say, every time I go to Canada for a conference, I always come back with overly pronouncing my O's, and I'm always worried if I'm going to start doing that during my actual talk versus like when I'm talking to everyone else, because then it's on record in front of hundreds of people. I was like, oh, oops, yeah.
That's okay. People can generally tell that I'm not Canadian by my accent. Um, I think what's unique about working for a binational organization, I think part of it is just the scope of the Great Lakes. We're talking about 40 million drinking water. We're talking about 8 states and 2 provinces, 2 languages, and the challenge, I think, is that people don't interact with the lakes on a basin wide. You can't even really conceptualize the basin wide. You look at a map, and even that, you see the lakes. There aren't stickers on people's car of the Great Lakes Basin. There's stickers on people's car of just the surface water of the lakes. And people really like to identify with, the Great Lakes as a region, but I think that people connect to spots and points on the lakes. And so you talk about the Great Lakes, and I think most people in their minds, they think of a special beach. And that's actually something that the Great Lakes Watermark Project that the IJC is working with Lake Ontario Waterkeeper to do sort of understands and helps to parse down, is that, yes, people care about the lakes, and whether they're like you, Nicole, where they're scientists working, devoting their career to different aspects of Great Lakes science, or they're like me, helping people understand any variety of the issues better, or if they're just everyday people who have other jobs that aren't specifically Great Lakes related. We all have a connection to the Great Lakes, but it's not basin wide. And so the challenge of a transboundary and binational organization is that we're concerned about the whole border, and we're concerned about the whole basin. But in order to engage people, it's difficult to engage them and say, well, how do you think all of the lakes are doing? And it's much easier, we've learned, to ask people, what is your part of the lake doing? How is your beachfront looking? Have you been able to swim there? And those are the kinds of questions that the IJC was asking when we held different public meetings throughout the basin in March. And that was part of the role that the IJC plays to help the governments of Canada and the United States to track the progress that they're doing under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. We have all these goals and annexes, but where are we on the trajectory of getting everything done? And so asking people, how are the Great Lakes doing? I mean, there's not really even one answer. You can talk about lake by lake and sort of relative to the status of those lakes. So instead, we ask people, what does your waterfront look like? What are your local priorities and needs? And I think with the transboundary and binational organization, it's not just that you have to also publish everything in French. That can be just sort of logistically challenging, but that you have to be at the 10,000 foot level and at the micro level, and communicate the importance of both to people, but listen to them wherever they are on that, because some people really are at the 10,000 foot level and do care about this whole ecosystem and the ecosystem approach and seeing the big picture. But some people, it's just about the stormwater or sewer outfall issues that are affecting the place where they put their kayak in on the waterfront. So it's an interesting balance to have to strike, and I think the IGC is doing a good job in at least learning where to move and how to balance all those competing interests across such a vast basin.
Yeah, I have to say, I do Scicomm for an organization that includes members from Canada, so I have to not only tweet in English, but I also have to tweet in French, and it is quite challenging to make sure you're getting everything right and doing all that together, and you don't want a certain segment of a society to feel that they're being left out with things, so you're trying to make sure you have that communication for everyone. But I thought your point too of how people just kind of think of their little regional areas within the Great Lakes, like my hometown, we're about an hour away from Lake Michigan. And so when I think of the Great Lakes, I usually think of Lake Michigan. And that's, for me, that is like my home lake that I like and I really enjoy. But there's so many issues that go on, whether it's Lake Superior that's far to the north of us or Lake Ontario that's so far to the east that there's only been one time where I actually ever made it all the way around Lake Ontario. I don't always notice the issues and things that may be going on over there. And so I think that's why it's really good with things that you guys have done to be able to get everyone to talk about their story. And I really like the Watermark program that you guys were putting on. I saw that at IAGLR last year. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. And anybody can contribute their watermark at any time. At watermarkproject.com and or watermarkproject.ca. And this is an initiative that the IGC is supporting Lake Ontario Waterkeeper completing. And so we're helping to funnel more stories around the Great Lakes. But Lake Ontario Waterkeeper is getting stories, just any water stories from people anywhere. I mean, we've got folks who tell stories about Europe or Africa. But the idea is that, maybe you have a birthmark that's sort of unique to only you, and so you also imprinted in your memory, your psyche, have a watermark, and so it's a place and or a moment in time that really connects you to the water. And there's videos, you can write short story or just submit a blurb with a photo, without a photo. There's different ways that you can submit your story to the watermark. And what's neat about the project is that they have a map. And so the map shows all the different water bodies, and some of them are inland lakes and rivers, and some of them are just like Lake Michigan writ large, right? And it's a really interesting way to, as a person, interact with other people and see, oh my gosh, like that's exactly the same experience I have. Or yeah, I could see why you're really committed to the Great Lakes. You have a cottage home and not every generation of your family has, spent summers there. What's interesting about the product too is it also substantiates the sort of intangible connection that people have to the lakes to demonstrate why things like funding for the Great Lakes restoration are so important, demonstrate why things like improving access to waterfront recreation, why all of the objectives for improving and maintaining Great Lakes water quality, how and why they're important to everyday people. And it's not just something that, here's my peer-reviewed study that says that fish consumption, blah, 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 that affecting whatever population of fishers. Like that's extremely valuable research that has to be funded. But if you can have stories from urban fishermen saying, I learned how to fry walleye from my grandfather, and that's something I always think of when I enjoy a meal from the river, those are intangible connections that also substantiate and help to support why it's so important to continue to fund and support Great Lakes restoration projects across the board.
Right, yeah, that makes a good point, because I think of my own research with mute swans. If I was to go into all the details of, the issues with the invasive mute swan in the Great Lakes, people might not necessarily get, okay, why them eating a weed from the lake, or, what they consider a weed, in their personal lives is such a big issue. But say if I show them a drawing that Abby McBride, who's a sketch biologist on Twitter, did for me when I was at NAOC of them chasing me on my kayak, that resonates with people and they get it and they understand, oh yes, this is an aggressive bird, shouldn't be here. Okay, we understand that now. And so to be able to put it into the terms that they can get it in, in a visual way too, I think sometimes helps them to be able to really picture that rather than, trying to, like you said earlier, with all that jargon that's associated with my research to how do you filter that down so people can understand? Because I need that too. It's, if it's another scientist that's just slightly outside my field, I'm basically that, member of I know we don't really using the term general public, but just kind of where you're at that base level knowledge and you're I don't understand this. Please explain this. And I'm a scientist and I don't always understand those things. So I need someone to draw me that pretty picture of some atom chasing a chemical element across the screen so I can understand what's going on. I can't just have you describe it and be like, nope, I don't get it. So
yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely.
So we have just a couple minutes left here. So if you have any last minute questions, make sure you send them in via the chat module here on Periscope. But if you don't get them in, or you're just kind of shy to have them live on air here, feel free to send them in afterwards via Twitter. But I know that you wanted to mention a little project that you're working on to try to see about how connections happen with programs like with apps like Periscope and other things. So you want to talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. So at IAGLR 2017, I'll be participating in the Social Great Lakes track, and what I'll be talking about is how social network analysis is a way to inform your Scicomm messaging, and in order to actually do more with less work in terms of who you can identify to help boost your message and how you should be tailoring your message depending on who your audience is. There's so many analytics and data that's possible for you to use, and it's hard for an average Scicomm starter to know exactly what's important. Follows are not really that important, but key connections such as at Wildlife BioGal are extremely important because that's how you can
there's
expand
no
your network.
You,
yeah, of course not. And so one thing that I'm hoping to show at IAGLR is I created a brand new account for today, and so it started at 0, beginning of this call or this webinar, whatever you're doing. This is Periscope. There you go. And so I'm interested to see if and how the network that you have with Scicomm Monday, how that informs this new account. So it's just a lot more pedestrian than my current handle, A Voglesong, and using some of the tools that are out there. In particular, I'll be using Netlytic, which is a really interesting social network analysis mapping tool that you can sign in through Twitter, and then it'll show you different, you can see topics that people are talking about connected to your network, but you can also see who the people in your network are that are talking about those topics. So to me, it'll be interesting to see through this Scicomm Monday who the followers are. And since it's a new account, it'll be starting at a blank slate, just going from 0 to that first increment of 1. And sort of mapping out what the network was for today's call would be really interesting. So if you are on Twitter, follow A Voglesong, and you'll be a node in the network that I'll be discussing at IAGLR 2017, 3 or 4 short weeks from now. So.
Yeah, it's going to be here a lot sooner than what we realize. I think all of us who are presenting are going into that, oh, yeah, it's just right around the corner. We better start putting our things together because it's going to be here before we know it. So
it is, yeah. But it'll be really great. So, and you'll be able to see the IJC office building from Coa Hall where the IAGLR is.
Yeah, I'm really excited for IAGLR this year, with it being in a bigger city. All the times I've been involved with the conferences with IAGLR, it's been at a university, so it'll be neat to see it kind of branch out and see how many more people are able to join in and be a part of it, with it being in that bigger city and with those bigger venues. So it should be pretty exciting. So
plenty to do.
In May, come hang out with us. So.
Yes, definitely. And I'm sure there'll be some periscoping going on of the Great Lakes, social Great Lakes. It's my guess.
Possibly. Just maybe. We'll see. Yeah, we all know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, we're really over time now, so I'm going to try to get things wrapped up. So any questions that anyone has, if you're watching this on replay, definitely connect with us on Twitter. And I just want to thank Allison for taking time for her Monday with joining us and talking to us all about her work with the Great Lakes and the Scicomm. And make sure you go check her out at IAGLR in a couple of weeks with her talk there. So
thank you, Nicole, for having me. Yeah. Thanks for doing Scicomm Monday. I think it really expands the networks that people have, and I've learned a lot on the different shows that you've had. So
Great. I'm
Thank
glad
you.
to hear, someone enjoying it. And, for me, half of it is one, that outreach to be able to share with everyone and expose everyone's science and their science communication. But part of it too is I think all of the folks that I have on are just really amazing people. So it's always a joy to be able to talk to you guys.
Well, that's really
So like I said, if you're wanting to get a hold of Allison afterwards, feel free to tweet her at her handle. I'm not even going to try to say Allison. I'll let you throw it at us.
It's Death Squad Salvador. I'm a hardcore fan of The Clash, so it's kind of like your first AOL AIM name,
Yep.
Yeah.
And you got to stick with it because it's you now. So
I know. You're stuck with it, yeah.
So for next week, we're going to have Rebecca Heisman. She's a Scicomm writer, so we're going to jump away from a little bit of the iAgler stuff for a little bit because Rebecca's really amazing. You can check out, she had a recent publication with the Sierra Club talking about beaver going further up north than what they've ever been seen before in North America, so that should be a good read for all of you. I'll put that link out later this afternoon, but make sure you tune in to learn how to do some Scicomm writing next week. And then if you want to get a hold of me, you can either tweet me at the Scicomm Monday handle or also my personal handle of Wildlife BioGal. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Make sure you go out, explore, do some science, have some fun, and hopefully we'll see you next Monday.